10,000 men of Harvard want victory today, for they know that o'er old Eli fair Harvard holds sway. So then we'll conquer old Eli's men, and when the game ends, we'll sing again. 10,000 men of Harvard gained victory today. 10,000 men of Harvard want victory today, for they know that o'er old Eli fair Harvard holds sway. So then we'll conquer old Eli's men, and when the game ends, we'll sing again. 10,000 men of Harvard gained victory today.
Welcome, everyone. I am Michelle Lamont, the director of the Weatherhead Center for International Studies, and it is our great privilege today to host His Highness, the Aga Khan. We are co-organizing this exceptional event in collaboration with the Al-Wahid Islamic Studies program. The Aga Khan, His Highness, is going to give the Jodidi lecture, which is the most distinguished lecture at the Weatherhead Center and also in the university as a whole. So in the context of globalization, we often, in the context of insecurity, witness a rigidification of group boundaries. And I think it's partly important for us as scholars and as human beings that we stop and reflect on the importance of pluralism and diversity. And who better to lead us in this endeavor than a spiritual leader such as the Aga Khan. The Weatherhead Center was created in the 1950s in the context of the Cold War, at the time when Henry Kissinger and Brzezinski were here at Harvard. At the time, we were really studying politics through the question of security, but today we have to think about cultural memberships, about group boundaries, about inequality, group competition as a condition for world peace. And it is in this context that the Weatherhead Center has really broadened its agenda. And we're now considering not only questions that are of relevance to international studies, but also to the study of comparative, global, transnational social problems. And political scientists, sociologists, anthropologists, as well as scholars from all the schools are collaborating in this endeavor.
Whether we are looking at a more fragile European Union, a more polarized United States, a more fervid Sunni-Shia conflict, intensified tribal rivalries in much of Africa and Asia, or other splintering threats in every corner of the planet, the word fragmentation seems to define our times. And so we ask ourselves, what are the resources that we might now draw upon to counter this trend? How can we go beyond our bold words and address the mystery of why our ideals still elude us? In responding to that question, I would ask you to think with me about the term I have used in the title of this lecture, the cosmopolitan ethic. For a very long time, as you know, the term most often used in describing the search for human understanding was the word tolerance. In fact, it was one of the words that was used in the 1955 text to describe one of the objectives of this Jadidi lecture. What this means, perhaps all else, is a readiness to participate in a true dialogue with diversity, not only in our personal relationships, but in institutional and international relationships also. But that takes work, and it takes patience. Above all, it implies a readiness to listen. What is needed, as the former Governor General of Canada, Adrienne Clarkson, has said, and I quote, is a readiness to listen to your neighbor even when you may not particularly like him. Is that message clear? You listen to people you don't like. There are a variety of ways in which we can work to build a culture of tolerance in a turbulent time. Many of them are reflected in the work of the Arkan Development Network.
Welcome to Building a Culture of Tolerance in a Turbulent Time, a program presented by the Ismaili Jamatkhana and Center USA in collaboration with the Ismaili Centre Toronto and in recognition of the International Day for Tolerance. I am joined today by my friend and colleague, Ismaili Laka, President of the Ismaili Council for Canada.
Thank you, President Al-Karim. I'm very happy to join you in recognition of the International Day for Tolerance.
The Jodidi Lecture is among the most prominent lecture series of the Weatherhead Center of International Affairs at Harvard University. It was established in 1955 with the key objective of promoting tolerance, understanding, goodwill among nations, and world peace. Broadly defined, tolerance is the ability to respect and accept the values, beliefs, cultures, and forms of expression that are different than yours. His Highness the Aga Khan, on delivering the Jodidi Lecture in 2015, stated that the word tolerance has now evolved, and we have come to use the word pluralism and a related concept, cosmopolitan, more appropriately.
President Al-Karim, if I may add to that, the world is witnessing unprecedented levels of migration. And with this comes opportunity to build tolerance to not only ensure peaceful coexistence of diverse communities, but also to thrive and flourish. Unfortunately, there are so many areas of the world where fragmentation and tribal loyalties have become the order of the day, and pluralism is still not part of the value system.
That's a great point, President Ismaili. You know, as His Highness has said when receiving the Tolerance Award at the Tutsing Evangelical Academy, and I quote, "Instead of shouting at one another, we must learn to listen to one another and learn from one another," unquote. A more cooperative world does not require us to erase our differences, but to understand and respect them. For hundreds of years, the greatest Islamic societies were pluralistic, drawing strength from people of many religions and cultural backgrounds.
I think there are many ways to build a culture of tolerance through legislation, education, and building awareness. This is reflected in the work of the Aga Khan Development Network, and more particularly in the work of the Global Center for Pluralism, which is based in Canada, but which over a period of time will have a reach that is global.
Thank you, President Al-Karim and President Ismaili, for your introductory remarks. Today, I have the pleasure of engaging in conversation with three Aga Khan Development Network, or AKDN, resident diplomatic representatives of His Highness the Aga Khan. Your Excellency, Munir Merali, diplomatic representative to the people of Bangladesh. Representative Merali has been involved in launching numerous projects, including the establishment of the University of Central Asia, the first microfinance bank, the Center for Philanthropy, Serena Hotel, Ismaili Centers, and other institutions. He holds a Master's in Business Administration from the University of Toronto and a Master's in Public Administration from the Harvard Kennedy School. We also have with us today Your Excellency Sherazad Hirji, diplomatic representative to the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan. Representative Hirji is a lawyer and has worked in the philanthropic sector for the past 30 years. Most recently, she was president and CEO of the Canadian Women's Foundation, where she dedicated her time to strengthening the ability of women and girls to move out of violence and poverty into confidence and leadership. She served on the National Committee of the Aga Khan Foundation Canada, on the Ismaili Council for Canada, and served as president of the Ismaili Council for Ontario between 2012 and 2019 before taking up her current role in October of 2019. We also have with us today Your Excellency Dr. Mahmoud Ibu, diplomatic representative to Canada and the delegation of the Ismaili Imamate. Representative Dr. Ibu was born in Kenya and educated at the Harrow School in England. He obtained a Bachelor of Science in Materials Technology and a PhD in Laser Engineering at Imperial College, London. He served for 10 years as the chairman of the Leaders International Forum, overseeing the Ismaili community's leadership in over 23 countries. Welcome, representatives, and thank you for accepting our invitation to join our program on building a culture of tolerance in a turbulent time. Representatives, the challenges to tolerance are manifold in both the developed world as well as the developing world. The impact of globalization means that many who have never met before now intermingle. However, while societies have grown more pluralistic in population makeup, are not necessarily growing more pluralistic in spirit. As His Highness the Aga Khan, who is chairman of the AKDN, has said, what is needed all across the world is a new cosmopolitan ethic rooted in a strong culture of tolerance. Representatives, I'd like to begin by asking you to briefly explain the current environment of tolerance, pluralism, and a cosmopolitan ethic in both the developed world as well as the developing world. Representative Ibu, shall we begin with you in the developed world, followed by Representatives Hirji and Merali in the developing world?
Well, thank you, First of all, for inviting my colleagues and myself to participate in this program for to commemorate the International Day of Tolerance. I think in sort of reflecting on your question, my experience has been that there is actually some confusion as to how people understand tolerance, how they understand pluralism. And for me, it is not an accommodation and it is not toleration. It is, diversity in society is a fact. How societies respond to diversity is a choice. So pluralism involves choosing to respond positively to diversity rather than treating it as a threat. So in answering your question, I sort of think of what are the parameters by which we could measure whether a society, a country is actually responsive to tolerance or pluralism or is not. And I think there are sort of one or two core ingredients that I look at. First of all, is it a society that is respectful? Is it a society that is open? Is it a society that sort of understands and embraces difference, not just understands this, but actually takes it on? And is there cooperation amongst peoples with a common purpose? And if I was to use that sort of definitional standard and look at the West, certainly the developed world today, I would say we're probably at risk of drifting away from those notions of respect, for openness, for understanding. I think there's a drift in the last perhaps 10 or 20 years towards being more individualistic, being more exclusive in its way than it has perhaps previously. But I would say with respect to Canada, which is a country that I'm located in at the moment, that Canada has always had embedded, certainly within the last century or so, within its cultural, societal DNA, the idea of embracing difference, the idea of embracing and accepting other people from different societies, ethnicities, cultures, etc. So I think Canada can be a role model. It can be an example of how a country over its 150 years, which did not start as a plural country at all, it had a very specific outlook at the time of being a Christian society, but how has it over its 150 years developed its thinking, it developed its society to be able to now be an example of how a pluralistic society can work, how it can enable tolerance. And that's not to say Canada is perfect, it isn't, but it's certainly, I think, an example that other Western countries who I think are drifting away from these ideas could value and listen to.
Representative Hirji.
Thank you so much, Manush. And like Representative Ibu, delighted and honored to be able to join this conversation. So I am now currently in Afghanistan, where, as I was reflecting on this question, what we are dealing with is the ultimate results of lack of tolerance, lack of pluralism, and lack of a cosmopolitan ethic. As you know, we are in the middle of a war here. We are in the middle of a civil war. And it is really due to the fact that different sides have different perspectives, different backgrounds, different contexts they're coming from, where they're not able to speak to each other and not able to come to some sense of a conclusion. And so the consequences are dire for the people, for the country, and for the opportunity that exists in Afghanistan. And so this real breakdown, I think, of understanding each other within the country has really led to consequences that are ultimately what happens when there is no tolerance. I think what is emerging here in Afghanistan is, a sense that there is a deep cultural history here that goes back 5,000 years, 2,000 years. And there's a sense of wanting to remember that there is a deep-rooted sense of pluralism where different people from different parts of the world have come, have lived, have thrived together, but that has been lost in more recent history. And there is a realization and a recognition that we have to come together within Afghanistan with our neighbors to have constructive conversations about pluralism, about understanding that we may come from different backgrounds, different ethnicities, different tribal contexts, but to build a country going forward, what we need to do is to recognize our differences, but focus on the strengths so that we build a country going forward on our strengths. And I think this is the kind of inflection point that I think Afghanistan is at right now when it comes to the notion of just tolerance for sure, getting to building pluralism. And I would say we haven't even entered the conversation about a cosmopolitan ethic yet. We are quite far from that conversation. We're somewhere between tolerance and pluralism as a country.
And Representative Merrily.
First of all, I'd like to echo the sentiments expressed by my colleagues. And once again, thank you for inviting us. I think the notion of tolerance, we need to take a little bit of a step back, in the sense that in many developing countries, including Bangladesh today, we have a rather homogeneous society, and there are inherent forces that promote tolerance and pluralism. For example, the modern Bangladeshi society today, if I can talk more about it, we have 170 million people, and majority of them, if not all, speak the Bengali language. 90% of them are Muslims. And the country and the region itself, since the 16th century, has gone through what we call is a political evolution. Remember that the country has gone through the struggle for the Bengali language in 1952, and then the struggle for independence. Today, the Bangladeshi society, as part of a developing world, brings together policymakers, educators, civil society leaders, business leaders to advocate for tolerance and social harmony, and recognizing that the need for dialogue is critical to bridge the divide. I remain optimistic while there's much work to be done, but with the social progress that the countries have made, including Bangladesh, both in the social side and on the economic side, I believe that given time ahead, inshallah, these matters are going to become part and parcel of the fabric and the ethos of a modern and a progressive society they're each trying to build. So I'm going to remain a little bit more optimistic.
So it seems like globally we have made progress over the years, but there is room for improvement. Representatives, can you briefly explain the focus of the AKDN mission in your respective regions and how this notion of tolerance manifested in your specific role as a diplomat in accomplishing the mission? Representative Merrily, we can begin with you.
Sure. The AKDN in Bangladesh has had a long presence since the 1950s. Our first investments were what today has become a thriving jute mill sector. There were a number of reasons for that. One, it is that you take an indigenous natural product, add value to that, and that generates livelihoods. Tens of thousands of jobs were created, and it helped the country earn foreign currency that it needed at the time. Following that, there was a significant milestone that in 2013, the government of Bangladesh and the AKDN agreed to intensify the bilateral relations. And that really led to the establishment, and now we are in the part of constructing the Aga Khan Academy. So we are focused now, we have pivoted from our initial economic investments in the country to focusing on improving the quality of education and building through the support of the government and His Highness. Inshallah, we will soon have the Aga Khan Academy, the first in a Muslim country. As for our role, I think it's critical that together with our reps throughout the world and wherever they've been working, it is very important that through diplomacy, through engagement with our key stakeholders, including government, civil society, that we work to raise the awareness of these important issues and espouse the values of tolerance by demonstrating best practices and the projects that we bring in and investments that we bring in that, inshallah, will become models that the societies can replicate.
Representative Ibu?
I think it's perhaps useful for the audience to understand the scope and scale of the AKDN in responding to that question. The AKDN is an instrumentality of the Ismaili Imamate to actually respond to quality of life in a multiplicity of societies, irrespective of denomination, culture, etc. And it really focuses on three main things: social development, economic development, and cultural development. In Canada, we have 10 agencies in the network. Almost all of them under this rubric operate in Canada. And I would say that what we seek to do here in Canada, because it's such a fertile ground, it's a country that welcomes diversity and tolerance. It's to the role has been to essentially invest in assets in Canada that can speak to these things. So the Aga Khan Trust for Culture, with its Parks and Gardens program, the Aga Khan Museum, the Ismaili Centers, through lectures like this, are all spaces and places that we use to promote this idea of engagement, of interaction, of finding ways in which we can bring people together, including the delegation of the Ismaili Imamate, which is the office that I occupy here in Ottawa as well. So a few of the things that we might do is, first of all, work with governments and with other embassies together to promote cultural diplomacy, to promote in other parts of the world where we might choose to operate together, like Afghanistan, for example, the programs that might promote women's education, women's health, things that might have in a different era of Afghanistan not been focused upon. We work together with the government to be able to bring those out. And I think education is a major component of the AKDN's mission here. Education about Islam, about the Muslim world, about its cultures, its civilizations, its histories, and its contributions, frankly, to the world of today. And the spaces and assets that are here are all designed to be able to allow us to use these assets as voices. And our job essentially within the AKDN office here is to essentially promote those assets, promote those ideas through all the relationships that we have with government, the civil society sectors, and with other diplomats from countries where we actually have common alignment and a presence.
Thank you. And I hope to later be able to touch or expand a little bit on those assets. But Representative Hirji, your thoughts on this question?
So I think what I will do, because I think my colleagues have laid out the broader framework under which AKDN works. In Afghanistan, we have been here since the mid-1990s. The AKDN was already working in Tajikistan, and our regional presence enabled us to come into Afghanistan from the north at a time of humanitarian crisis. And what you know is that Afghanistan's indicators, if you look at any indicator from health, education, economics, were dire. And so we worked with the government of Afghanistan to sign an accord with the Ismaili Imamate and the government that provided an enabling framework. And under that framework, we were able to carry out activities that include the economic side of our portfolio. So the first microfinance banks, Serena Hotels, a new Balatan Energy, Roshan Telecom, our early investments. And on the not-for-profit side, we have the Aga Khan Foundation, Aga Khan Agency Habitat, Health Services, Cultural Services. So we have 11 agencies in total. And the idea for this work was to really do ground-up community work, to look at what was needed by Afghans, to help them prioritize within the context of the government's priorities, to help rebuild, to help create an environment and the conditions on the ground in the community that lead to peace and prosperity for all Afghans in the future. And so over time, our footprint has expanded very deeply, I would say, into about 8 provinces in Afghanistan, broadly into about 20 provinces, and more broadly into all 34 provinces. And so we are a very active partner. We also bring, because we are both a donor and an implementing partner here, so many of our donor partners have no agencies of their own, and so we become a preferred partner of choice because of the quality we bring to our work, whether it's in the healthcare field, whether it's in education, whether it's in livelihood, whether it's in gender issues, education for girls. We are looked at both by government and our donor partners as the agency or as the organization of choice to partner with to make change in Afghanistan. So that generally is the work that we are doing here. I'll give you an example. Since we started in 2002, formally under this accord, the Aga Khan Cultural Services, the Aga Khan Trust for Culture, has restored over 140 important monuments across the country. Again, connecting people back to their heritage here in Afghanistan. So that's the nature and the general kind of work that we do here.
Thank you, Representative Hirji. Representative Dr. Ibu, in an interview that you gave with Quartz, which is an international news organization, when discussing how to reconcile the West with Islam, you said, the only way to counter the monolithic view of Islam today, of it being an ill-educated and violent faith, is through bringing out these aspects of knowledge. Dr. Ibu, can you explain what you mean by this and provide some examples on the various projects or assets of the AKDN in Canada that perhaps shine light on ways to counter this view?
Well, I think when that interview took place, it was really to respond to a question where it was fairly obvious that people's understanding and knowledge of the Muslim world was actually quite thin, particularly in Western societies. And His Highness the Aga Khan has said this in numerous speeches where he's felt that there is a clash of ignorance and a lack of understanding of the Muslim world and its histories and contributions. For me, I think it is lost on many people. To illustrate with some examples, the contributions that Islam has had to mathematics. Today, everybody in a school will have studied Al-Khwarizmi's mathematical model, which in Arabic is Al-Jabra wa Muqabla. Al-Jabra. And everybody studies Al-Jabra. But nobody understands that its rooting is from a mathematical construct from a Muslim scientist. Or poetry and literature. Rumi has written the longest love poem in human history. Or Ibn Sina with respect to medicine. And I think, or even Islam's focus on beauty, the environment, and therefore the genesis of the focus on parks and gardens that go back to the Mughal era and much, much earlier. And my sense is that there needs to be a better education of Islam's contributions, and that was the point I was making. I think in Canada, all the assets that we have, the garden, Aga Khan Garden in Edmonton, the Aga Khan Park in Toronto, the Ismaili Centres, the delegation, the museum, if you even look at the way they have been designed, they are symbolic in their architecture, in the way that they're constructed, that every element of that space somehow symbolizes these characteristics of knowledge, of music, of literacy, of culture. And the purpose of these spaces really then is for us to help people engage, educate them, and open a door of inquiry. We hope that they will come away from some of these projects with a view to say, you know, I didn't know that about the Muslim world. I didn't understand that. And I'm going to go and find out more about it. It invites this notion of curiosity and response through what we are able to present and educate through these different mediums. So we have these, what I would call physical ones. And we, of course, also have the Global Centre for Pluralism, which I can speak to a little bit, because I think it's an important notion in the Canadian context. We've spoken earlier in this conversation about His Highness's focus on pluralism. And for the longest time, he was wrestling with the idea of a way in which we could not make it just a simple conceptual word, but how would we actually bring it to life, to action, to relevance in the world today. And in conversations with former Prime Ministers of Canada, starting from Jean Chrétien, and then with Paul Martin, and then eventually with Stephen Harper, the idea of using Canadian experience. It is, after all, part of Canada's identity. Pluralism is a defining characteristic of Canada. It's a core element of the country's identity. To see how we could bring our understanding and knowledge historically of pluralism, which, by the way, has been prevalent in the Muslim world, but not well understood, together with Canada, and to create an institution that could respond to and educate how pluralism in action actually does work and benefit human society. So I think our projects have been engineered by His Highness, the ones in Canada, to bring these notions out in a very vibrant way, vibrant and engaging way.
It's fascinating to see how through education, research, and collaboration, these assets that you mentioned serve as key mediators of fostering dialogue and promoting tolerance and mutual understanding among people. Representative Merrily, sorry, go ahead, Dr. Ibu.
If I might, Benush, just to give an illustration of how the idea was put into action. If you look at the Winford site complex of the Ismaili Centre, the Aga Khan Park, and the Aga Khan Museum, and you ask, how was this built? You have the Ismaili Centre, whose architect was an Indian Catholic, Charles Correa. You have the park itself was built and designed by Vladimir Jurovich, who is a Lebanese Christian. And you have the Aga Khan Museum built and designed by Fumihiko Maki, who is a Japanese. And they're all coming together to build this complex for a Muslim leader. That in and of itself is a demonstration of how you bring the best together, irrespective of their culture, their background, their history, to say, how do we work together to build something that is essentially beautiful, representational, and can speak to our common values.
And I like the term you used, Dr. Ibu, pluralism in action. Representative Merrily, in a recent interview you gave to the Dhaka Tribune on education as a key area of investment or interest for the AKDN, you said the network is committed to enhancing its investment in the education sector with the establishment of the Aga Khan Academy, Dhaka. Representative Merrily, can you tell us more about the academies in general, and specifically why an academy, an Aga Khan Academy in Dhaka, and this emphasis on education and its role in promoting pluralism?
Absolutely, Benush. I think you will recall that it was in 2000 that when His Highness initiated the establishment of a globally integrated network of schools, and the plan is to have these in some 18 countries. Today, we have got academies in Kenya, India, Mozambique, and inshallah, as I said before, we will have one in Bangladesh. The key objectives of these academies, in addition to offering a world-class education, is also to support the national and regional development goals. Let me explain. The first really is to provide an international standard of education and strong leadership experience to talented students who are selected on merit, so that they may facilitate the development of homegrown global leaders. And today, if you may know, that Bangladesh has one of the largest public systems anywhere in the world. We've got over 40 million students. And if we can make an impact on the quality of education in a country like Bangladesh, we can have a multiple collateral benefit coming out of the project. The second is that how do we build and strengthen the national education system? Many international organizations like UNICEF and others have pointed out that one of the deficiencies of an education system in a developing world is the quality of education, is the quality of teaching. And the academies are going to address some of those issues by having a professional development center right on the campus, which will work with educators in the region, and through modeling of best practice, inshallah, we can make a difference also in the quality of education. The notion of tolerance and pluralism is really embedded throughout the academy project. This is from the merit-based selection process, regardless of socioeconomic background, race, religion, ethnicity, culture, to facilitating students and teachers to learn and work in another country. Thereby what you're doing is really is extending the pluralism of each of the academy community globally and internationally. So you could potentially have a student, for example, that we can have from the northern city of Sylhet in Bangladesh, come to Dhaka, stay there for a couple of years, live there, learn, and perhaps decide that she would like to spend a couple of years in Maputo, or maybe in Mombasa, or wherever else it may be. Can you imagine the impact of that and how that would aid to the practice of global citizenship? You know, working through this project now in Bangladesh, quite frankly, I wish I was going back to school.
Representative Merrilee, this project represents a significant investment by the network in the education sector, and I believe will help foster the next generation of scholars who will not only be prepared to contribute to the social development of Bangladesh, but also the economic development of Bangladesh.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think one of the challenges of a country like Bangladesh is that how many of the Bangladeshis, talented kids, can actually leave the country and get the best of education outside? There are many impediments, many challenges ahead. So in some small way, inshallah, the Academy will help address those needs, and we'll have talented Bangladesh children stay in their home country and get the world-class education so that perhaps they can go back for higher education outside the country, and they will return to Bangladesh and to contribute to the growth and trajectory and the prosperity of the country that we all expect from Bangladesh.
Now, Representative Hirji, the Afghan Ministry of Foreign Affairs published a press release of a meeting between you and the Deputy Foreign Minister for Management and Resources, Ms. Nahid Essar. And the meeting included a discussion around the future AKDN projects in the areas of education and healthcare. And it concluded with discussing ways to enhance women's leadership roles in Afghanistan. Representative Hirji, can you expand upon future initiatives or opportunities for women in leadership in Afghanistan that you believe will strengthen this notion of pluralism?
Earlier this year, for International Women's Day, Time magazine published a list of the 100 most influential women of this century, and one of them was an Afghan woman, Queen Tarzi. Afghan women have been powerful in their own way for a very long time. I think the more recent history has not been as positive. What we have tried to do as the AKDN is really to invest in women, in women's leadership, in women's capacity, in women's professional skills development through a variety of methods. And we've done this because the government itself is also investing in women. So this is a countrywide national initiative to make sure that women are not left behind. The corollary of that is that that's not a consistently held belief, which is why we're going through the issues we're going through right now, including talks in Doha around peace negotiations, where the role of women is one of the issues for discussion because there's not alignment on all parties. But the reality, the ground reality, is that women in Afghanistan and girls are strong. They have gone through tremendous growth over the last 20 years, investment in education, which we have been very much a part of. You see girls in every aspect of Afghan life, from STEM, robotics teams, to skateboarding, to bicycling, to getting to the highest peak in Afghanistan, mountain climbing. And you see them excel in government. You see them excel in the military. They are everywhere. They are judges. So there is this investment in women. As the AKDN, we look at the whole, I would say the whole continuum from the ground, basic education for girls as they move up, opportunities to pursue professions. We've invested in developing nursing profession here, for example, working with the Aga Khan University in Karachi. And then as you get further into the variety of the kinds of things women do, livelihoods from small micro financing loans for women, all the way into postgraduate medical education. So we have cardiac surgeons, pediatric surgeons who are women. I just came back from a visit to Badakhshan, the province where we manage the entire healthcare system. And I met a group of women doctors who are absolutely stellar and who could really take on any woman doctor in the world and be as successful as they have been. So this is part of our investment as AKDN is in human talent, and particularly for women, to make sure that they have the opportunity, whether they want to go into entrepreneurship, whether they want to go into business, whether they want to go into the professions. And within our own agencies, we make sure that we find ways to promote women through the hiring process on a merit basis, of course, but always making sure that we are watching for gender balance in our management, in our leadership, in our operations. And so it's a holistic way to look at women. And again, working with government and government priorities and with other donors who are also focused on making advances for women in this country so that they can catch up to their potential in the country.
It seems like a key area of interest, Representative Hirji, for the network is to advance women's empowerment by increasing their social and economic participation in public life. So it's wonderful to hear of this type of work that's been done in Afghanistan.
Thank you. And just to add, if I could add that I think the conventional wisdom has been there for a long time, is that when you educate a girl or a woman, you're actually educating a family and through them a community. So the impact of change when you invest in women has been proven to be much beyond the sole investment in one individual. So that I think is a multiplier benefit of investing in women, which we are very much proud of here as well.
Well, you know, that takes me to my next question of, we've had this lengthy discussion on the various projects of the AKDN in your respective regions. Would you agree that the local context informs the projects or not? And if so, how? Representative Hirji, we can start with you.
Sure. Indeed, our work really is very much community focused. The community priorities matter because if the community identifies its priorities, and that's what we invest in, then the chances that it will be successful, sustained, have benefits in the community are much higher. You have to, though, balance that with the priorities of the government. And generally, there is alignment. If the government priorities are around health and education and economic development, those are generally, and cultural development, those are the areas the AKDN is involved in. So what we would try and do is work with the communities where we work, identify what they want as communities, do the consensus building around that community, around the project, whether it's building a well or a school or a small health clinic, making sure that there's ownership in the ultimate decision about what happens in that community. So again, working within government frameworks and government structures, which there are in this country, but we cannot do that without the community's input. And it's not just input, you then have to make sure that you are building skills and capacity to carry on whatever project it is. If it's a small school, are you investing in the teachers in the community so that they can teach quality education? If it's a healthcare system, if it's a health clinic, are there adequate midwives? Are there adequate nurses? Are there adequate access to a hospital within a couple of hours? So we look at the entire holistic nature of what we do. So yes, it starts with the community, but it also has to work through a systematic way, and then also kind of align to what government priorities are as well.
Representative Dr. Ibu, your thoughts?
Well, I think the projects in Canada, to respond to your question, ought to be understood in a perhaps a global context. So while they may be in a particular country, there are threads that are connecting projects here and what we do here in the context here with a global village, if we were to put it that way. So if we look, for example, at our projects here that are parks and gardens and ask that question, the first thing we would ask ourselves is, why is it important to have those things here? And I think what is important as a universal principle is that they are important in the context of the ethic of a sustainable environment, which is important in Islam as a principle. And environment, for example, doesn't mean just the space, it means physical, social, and cultural. And that we have a duty of trusteeship. We have the responsibility globally, not just in Canada, to be looking at issues of the environment because they impact our habitat and the future of mankind. So the parks and gardens, for example, act as a catalyst for social change and economic development. And that's a really important principle to understand. It's not just the aesthetics of a space, but what it actually does to mobilizing people and societies forward within this notion of pluralism and tolerance, and providing spaces that enable that to happen. You know, we have parks and gardens in 10. There are 10 in the fastest growing cities in the world. 13 of them are in places where we operate and where we look at these green spaces. And they are cities today that are so poor in green spaces, in environment, they're crowded, etc. So green spaces become lungs, and they become enabling spaces, not just for social interaction, but actually for physically altering the climate zone in that local in that context. And we find that, you know, people come from all societal backgrounds, whether they are educated professionals or whether they're the poorest people. They come to these spaces. Representative Scheherazade will probably speak to, you know, what the impact has been of the Bagh Babur in Kabul. And you can be next to a family from a completely different social background, but it humanizes, if I was to put it that way, people being together. There is no threat in a park or a garden. And I think the context here in Canada for us was also the idea in having these projects was that they would enable Canadians and others who come into Canada to see these as examples of how they can act as agents for change and how they actually affect change going forward. And I think what it does is then it acts as a catalyst to allow greater respect for not only human rights and the environment, but for the idea of tolerance and pluralism through these things. So while the contexts in Canada are informed by Canadians and their openness and willingness to see these kinds of things, they are linked, I think, to a global strategy of how we can bring these things out in difficult contexts as well as in easier contexts here. I mean, you might ask why we have a garden in Edmonton, Canada. It is the most, by the way, the most northernmost Islamic garden in the world, and understanding that Edmonton is frozen for most of the year. But it is illustrative that these kinds of spaces don't have to be in the Muslim world. They can be in a Canadian context, and they're adaptable to a Canadian context. And so it is with all of the other projects that we actually have here in Canada. So I would respond to it in that way.
And Representative Merrily?
You know, building on some of the good comments and very relevant comments by my colleagues, I would like to echo that development of any project or any program is really deeply rooted to address the needs and aspirations of the country and of the local community. I remember my first very visit to the Afghan Badakhshan. I was struck by the notion that the infant and maternal mortality rates at that time, they were one of the highest in the world. And I think Representative Scheherazade is quite aware of those challenges. And in the sense that, you know, how do we respond? One of the first projects that we brought on the Afghan side was Women Health Center to help the women that were going through some of the most challenging issues with their health. And that led to, in the later years, of developing a telehealth center in the border city of Korog, which today actually looks after the populations on both sides of the river. So I think this is the way that we would like to respond to some of the needs of the community, and all programming is really embedded in what are the needs and how we can respond to them effectively. In an indirect way, if you look at today the Aga Khan Awards program, the Aga Khan Awards architecture program in Bangladesh, we have had a very, very unique situation in which that we have had 5 winners of the awards. Now, it is interesting to say that whether a school has won the award or a mosque has won the award, or if it's an NGO center, they all speak to the issues of the country. So, for example, how does urban planning affect on the quality of life? So, by and through this project and through this award, we are facilitating such discussion. I remember last week when I was talking to one of the ministers in Dhaka, and he said that you had the school, which is a floating school, that won the award in the last cycle. Now, please tell me, how can we use this idea to combat climate change? As Bangladesh, as you know, is one of the countries which stands to be greatest impacted to the effects of climate change. So whether we implement a direct project to address the need, or we facilitate discussions through the project and through our system to the wider AKTN system to address the needs not only of the communities but also some of the critical issues that the countries are facing.
Now, it's worthy to note that the Ismaili councils across the United States have held a number of outreach events with our academic and our civic partners to highlight the winners and listed projects in the recent cycle of the Aga Khan Award for Architecture. And I have to say, Representative Merrily, that the Arcadia Education project that you briefly mentioned in particular has received praise for its innovative design. So congratulations to the architects and to Bangladesh.
Absolutely, and the architect is a very senior member of the community in the sense that he has done many, many projects. And if you read about the history on how we stumbled upon this project, it's even more interesting. But today, I must say that Saiful Haq is in the greatest demand of people not only in Bangladesh, but also to those countries which are grappling with on how do we mitigate against the effect of climate.
So I'd like to turn our focus now on the infrastructure work that the AKDN has been engaged in, and the first that comes to mind are bridges. It seems that the network has involved itself in a significant way in building actual bridges in the Central Asian countries. In 2006, His Highness the Aga Khan, when speaking at the inauguration of the Ishkashin Bridge, which is one of 5 bridges by the AKDN, built by the AKDN, he said, "It has always seemed to me that bridges are amongst the most powerful and important symbols in human society, symbols of connection, of cooperation, and of harmony." Representative Hirji, how significant are these bridges to the people of these communities, and can you explain its impact on fostering the narratives that we've been discussing?
I think that's such a fitting analogy to the conversation we're having around tolerance and pluralism, because that's a physical, very physical representation of getting to know people on the other side, so to speak. For Afghanistan, I would say those bridges have been transformative for those communities. Prior to the bridges being built, people would have to travel hours, almost a day's worth, to get to Faizabad, to get to a market, to get to Shubnan, to get to different places. The bridges have cut down the time that people spend in traveling. They have strengthened relationships on both sides of the country. I remember hearing a story that at one point, Afghanistan, northern Afghanistan, where honey is used for medicinal purposes, didn't have enough honey, and so would have to import honey from Tajikistan. As a result of the investments we've made, as a result of the bridges now, honey from Afghanistan is now sent to the markets in Tajikistan. So there's some very concrete examples, and I think if I step back a little bit more broadly, what these bridges have been really doing is to try and build a regional sense of strength as a region. And I think between Tajikistan and Afghanistan, between even northern Pakistan, Our energy projects, for example, really cut across this region, not just one or two countries. And I think that is another strength that AKDN brings. So to come back to these bridges, what they have enabled over time, and I think Representative Munir spoke to this earlier, is even healthcare services. So because of the isolation of some of the northern populations, it's so much faster and easier for them to get to Koro for treatment across the border, across one of those bridges, than it is to get to the southern part of Afghanistan, into Faizabad, to get the treatment that they need. And so I think in many different ways, these bridges have been avenues for opportunity and the avenue for collaboration between communities that were so isolated in the past and are now coming to become part of the evolution of Afghanistan as a strong country. And so I think if we can talk about bridges, we can talk about roads. The AKDN here has built thousands of kilometers of roads just to make sure that there's accessibility. And I could tell you lots of stories about the infrastructure projects that have really transformed lives. And the latest one is Badakhshan Energy, which is a power investment by ACFED, by IPS, and it is going to take over and electrify the entire province of Badakhshan over a 15-year period. So infrastructure has gotten more sophisticated beyond those bridges, but those bridges were the very early building blocks, I would say, in Afghanistan.
It's also worthy to note here that at the time of the opening of the Ishkashim Bridge, which connected Tajikistan and Afghanistan, Representative Merely, you were the representative in Tajikistan, and His Highness was also present at the opening. What were some of the reasons for such cross-border bridge building, and what were some of the challenges, Representative Merely, that you encountered in convincing both sides as to the benefit of this project?
This is a very interesting question. It also brings back very fond memories for me. As you know, since 2002, the bridges have served as a primary and the only connection between the two provinces of the Tajik Gorno-Badakhshan and of the Afghan Badakhshan. And as you know, that these areas are highly isolated and face numerous challenges, from economic to the threat of natural disasters. So the bridge, therefore, have become a key conduit for humanitarian assistance and to promote economic development. One of the things that we installed is that, and I hope Representative Sherzadeh will have a chance to visit some of this, is that, you know, we have installed markets at each of these bridges. If you were to go on the market days, there'll be buzzing about bartering and selling and bringing produce and products from all over the place. It's quite an exciting place. But the issue is that the notion of the bridges, as Representative Sherzadeh said, they were the building blocks. And what has happened is that through that collaboration, we now are bringing much more services, including education. I remember that when I was in Korog, we used to bring Afghans, young Afghans, across the border, and they were studying at the University of Central Asia, whether it's English or technology or skills, and they used to go back. And then we started working in medicine. So I think as has been rightly said, that the bridges have now become a building block to many other services. And I remember that when we were negotiating a power purchase agreement between Tajikistan and Afghanistan, it was through this bridges program that the first electricity sale took place between Tajikistan and Afghanistan. In terms of the challenge, Venush, we had our fair share of challenges. You need to appreciate that the river Pianj is not only an international border, but for 70 years, it was really an ideological divide between Soviet Union and South Asia and Afghanistan. So that was our first challenge to overcome. But I think one of the challenges that we really had to work through the local governments and the central government, donor and development partners, was to ensure the integrity of the border. it was important that we foster the safety and security of the communities on both sides of the border. And I think that it was through this support that we had of the local communities, local governments, that we were able to be successful to overcome some of these challenges. But I must say that, inshallah, looking at this 4, 5, 6 bridges now that we have, I'm assuming that that through trade, through transfer of humanitarian assistance, through economic development, I think it will bring good progress to these very isolated peoples in Afghan Badakhshan and also in Ramadan.
It seems like a key takeaway here is that the network is invested in providing opportunity and access to the people.
But can I just build on that?
Sure.
Sorry, Manush. If we fast forward now 15 years later from those initial bridges, what we're now seeing is the governors on both sides of the bridges in different countries asking our support to actually do cross-border memorandum of understanding, which we now have, to really regularize and to increase and to strengthen the partnerships cross-border. And the government of Afghanistan, the foreign minister, was actually in Tajikistan just a couple of weeks ago doing the same thing with the Tajik government to say we need to think regionally, we need to think about building strength, stability in Afghanistan, economic and all kinds of stability and prosperity can benefit the region. And so I think going from these kind of individual bridges, we are now looking at country cross-border collaboration in very dramatic ways. And so I think that's a tribute to the very early investment of AKDN looking at cross-border work.
Thank you, Representative Hirji, from that. And I think you and Representative Merrily touched on it, that the bridges really served as that foundation, and now we're actually building upon that and engaging in fostering some of the narratives that we've been discussing today. Mm-hmm. Representative Dr. Ibu, in Canada, the AKDN, as you also mentioned, has presented several parks and gardens as gifts to the Canadian cities. So, for example, Toronto, and you touched a little bit in Edmonton, in the hope that they will enhance the quality of life for not only the residents, but also its visitors. Dr. Ibu, how do these parks contribute towards what we've been discussing? And I know you touched upon this, and I also want to ask, and I think you also have mentioned this, but I'd like to see if I can get another maybe expansion to your responses. Would you argue that that there is an economic and or social and cultural role that these parks play, or is it simply aesthetics?
Well, thank you, Banush. But before I respond to that, I have one other addition to the conversation about bridges,
sure,
if I might. And that is that while we were discussing physical bridges, I think it's probably important for us to remember the value of knowledge bridges. And they have as much impact in many ways. So, for example, Canada has been an extraordinary knowledge bridge to things that we would be doing in the developing world. For example, very early on, Canada played a very important role in the initiation of the School of Nursing at the Aga Khan University in Karachi. And that knowledge bridge enabled a whole new industry, bringing value to a profession which was otherwise undervalued in a country like Pakistan, and creating a whole new opportunity for young women to play a positive role in that society. So I think we should also remember the impact of knowledge bridges, and that's just one illustration as well of the kind of impact that knowledge transfer can also bring. I think coming back to your question of the gardens and the aesthetics, and yes, I did speak to some of these points a little bit earlier. It's not a question of just the aesthetics. In Islam, gardens are a representation of what we understand in the Quran to be paradise. Paradise is always described in many ways as being a garden. So it is not just the reflection of what we might think of as being beautiful or spiritual, or even a space in which one can connect to a higher self or a spiritual domain. The gardens for us, I think, also are enablers, as I mentioned before, enablers for societal integration, interplay, interchange. Some of the gardens that we might have, for example, have been an opportunity to expand a completely new dimension of economic opportunity and to foster a set of conditions that have enabled people who had nothing to have something. For an example, Azhar in Egypt, the Al-Azhar Park, which was, built on a rubbish dump that was 500 years old, half a millennium years old, which is now the largest green lung in the Middle East, also spawned around it, which were slums, a whole new industry of opportunity where people revived their artisanship, their craftsmanship, etc., and it became an enabler. So I think whether the garden is in Edmonton or in Toronto, or as we have a small one here in the delegation in Ottawa, or the 5 or 6 or 7 that are representational in the Aga Khan Center in London, they are all spaces not just for people to be connected to in a sort of spiritual or aesthetic way, but in a much broader way. For example, as I mentioned before, respect for others in this space. It also has promoted good governance, strengthening of civil society. And in fact, most of our gardens actually are self-sustaining, if not generating money. And so there is a way in which the impact is well beyond conservation in many ways, or just simply a space in which people can come together. They actually have a much wider impact. The garden in Edmonton is relatively new. It was opened by His Highness in 2018. And so it's in its early infancy. People are just beginning to recognize and appreciate that there is an Islamic garden, which is, I think, about 17 acres. But what's interesting is it's co-located in the University of Alberta Botanical Gardens, which is a huge space of about 3,000 acres, not fully developed. But next to the Aga Khan Islamic Gardens is the Japanese Gardens. So you can begin to see an interplay that beauty has different manifestations, different representations, different interpretations. You can walk through the Japanese garden and walk through the Aga Khan Gardens and have a completely different sort of experiential surrounding, but it generates something within you that I think is enlightenment in some ways. But to come back to your question, they're not just aesthetics. They serve a multiplicity of other functions that are absolutely important to the whole subject of improvement of quality of life, to the discussion on pluralism and tolerance, all of which are manifested in these spaces that we call gardens or parks.
So I know we've discussed building bridges and physical bridges and metaphorically speaking as well, but we know that building bridges requires successful partnerships. Representatives, can you share with whom the AKDN partners with in your respective regions and the roles that these partners play in accomplishing the network's mission? Representative Dr. Ibu, we can begin with you.
Well, I must say we are greatly favored to have a partner like the Government of Canada, who I think not across the whole spectrum of activities that we've been involved with in social development, cultural development, as well as economic development, have been a powerful partner. Representative Scheherazade is a Canadian. Representative Munir is a Canadian. I am not a Canadian, but nevertheless, I think they could also speak to the value that these partnerships with Canada have brought. We have a broad range of what I would call bilateral partners that have helped us in the developing world, that have common sets of a common outlook. In fact, what I would call a cosmopolitan outlook. Their value set and our value set in terms of improvement of quality of life, ensuring that we can address issues such as the reduction of poverty, enablement of women, whether it's healthcare, are all very much aligned. And I would say that we have with Canada over the last 50 years had a significant impact. And just to illustrate one such project is the hospital in Bamiyan. funded by the Canadian government in partnership with others, but principally by the Canadian government, in a remote area of northern Afghanistan, where I think Representative Merali mentioned earlier that there was virtually no healthcare at all. Maternal and child mortality was extraordinarily high, and how Canada helped us build a hospital that today has enabled that mortality rate to be dropped to almost non-existent levels. And even something like solar energy, for example, we had a Canadian partner that enabled that particular facility to reduce its operating cost and to generate clean energy through clean energy rather than through diesel generators. So our partnerships, I think, with Canada have been broad and strong. And I must say we are indebted and grateful to the government of Canada, as well as to our partners in Europe, the Germans and the Norwegians and the European Unions and the French, who have also been powerful partners for us in our endeavors in the developing world.
Representative Merali.
I think, Benush, you have touched upon a very important issue. All Acadian projects, all our investments are actually through valued partnership, whether they are with the host government or whether they are with donor and development partners. And it is that partnership that brings facilitation, that brings enabling conditions so that our agencies can make those investments that are necessary. Let me give you one example. In Tajikistan, again in the town of Korog, if I go there, there was an old Soviet era hydropower station. And together with the support of the local government, support of the state government, we brought in the World Bank, we brought in the Swiss Development Corporation, we brought in US aid, and what that resulted was in a public-private partnership, the first in Tajikistan. And today we have one of the most successful hydropower projects run by ACFED that is supplying electricity to southern Tajikistan and thousands of communities across the river into Afghanistan. I think this notion of partnership is very, very important, and my colleagues here will agree with me that this is also one of the most important roles that the Acadian office and the diplomatic representatives play, is that we go out there, we foster relationships, we facilitate this process, we look for opportunities for our agencies, and inshallah, when the enabling conditions are there, investment and projects are launched. I think this is a very important issue, the value of partnerships. And as you may know, today, Ismaili Mamat and the Acadian enjoy privileged relationships with a number of countries and with a number of development partners. And this is really critical function that we play through our role as a diplomat to the Acadian people.
And Representative Hirji.
So my colleagues have, I think, touched on the key partners. In Afghanistan here, there are about 40 countries very active in different ways, trying to support, to strengthen, and to really help Afghanistan get to peace and prosperity. And so our role is to work with every one of them to support their areas of interest, but also to make sure that we are moving our vision as AKBN forward in the country also. I think the one partner that I want to highlight, and sometimes we forget that as the AKBN, we have a tremendous amount of internal strength within our network. And that has been invaluable for Afghanistan. So if I think about, Representative Ibu mentioned the Aga Khan University in Karachi, it actually operates the French Medical Institute for Mothers and Children here in Kabul. That is a partnership between French government, Afghanistan government, the AKBN, and a French charity called Latin Diaspora. It's a unique four-party partnership, but it is run through the expertise of AKU. And FMIC, when it does conferences, when it does events, when it goes focusing on COVID, then really infuses that knowledge, and Chairman talked about the knowledge, into the rest of the system in Afghanistan. And so our own agencies and the University of Central Asia, we use UCA in tremendous ways here to help build capacity. UCA created for Afghanistan a very special executive masters in economic policy program. Did not exist previously in Afghanistan. Some of our brightest young people working in the Ministry of Finance, Ministry of the Economy go through this particular executive masters program. And so we're creating knowledge, we're creating expertise at a very high level. Again, that is thanks to our internal network. Even Badakhshan Energy, its roots go back to what Representative Nurali talked about in Tajikistan as Pamir Energy. And we've leveraged that expertise now into Afghanistan to help build Afghanistan's own capacity. And so I do want to acknowledge that within the AKDN, we are very, very privileged to have a set of internal relationships, whether it's on healthcare and COVID, or many of these other areas that I talked about, in addition to our international bilateral partners as well.
So I know in our discussions today, this concept of an enabling environment was raised. And in 2001, His Highness the Aga Khan delivered a speech at the Conference of Indigenous Philanthropy in Islamabad. And he shared his perspective on how the movement towards self-reliance can be effectively supported and encouraged, not only at the national levels, but also the community and individual levels. And one way in particular was to look for ways to strengthen what he calls an enabling environment. Representatives, can you share how the AKDN projects contribute to this enabling environment, and specifically those that contribute to a community or an individual becoming more self-reliant? I know, Dr. Ibu, you touched a little bit about this notion of an enabling environment in the various projects in Canada.
Yes, I mean, I think in thinking through that particular question, there is an enabling environment where conditions are such, perhaps in Afghanistan, perhaps in Bangladesh, where people are trying to get to a point in their lives where they have control over the destiny of their own lives. For us, an enabling environment, the word enabling really means that an individual has control over their life. They have dignity in what it is that they're doing. They have value in how they see the future, and that gives them hope for a better future for their families and for their children and their grandchildren in the future. So the conditions for an enabling environment in Dhaka or in Kabul may be slightly different from the enabling conditions in Toronto or in Vancouver, where that is, while an issue, not such a huge issue for the society that we have here. In Canada, the enabling environment, as I would view it, given what we have to do here, are the conditions that allow people to be open-minded, to be able to reflect, to engage. It's facilitating that space and those places that enable discussion, dialogue, openness, conversation about differences, whether they are theological differences, whether they are cultural differences, whether they are even economic differences. And I think what we are attempting to do in Canada is to create the enabling environment for those kinds of conversations, for those kinds of enabling factors that actually promote the idea of tolerance and the idea of pluralism. We're not so much, I think, driven in the Canadian context of looking at how we are going to move somebody who is impoverished and in difficulty, who doesn't have access to healthcare, doesn't have access to education. We have all of those things here to a level where they can be self-empowered. And maybe my colleague representatives could perhaps speak to the work that is being done to create those enabling conditions in that sort of a context in their environment.
Mm.
Representatives Hirji and Marilee, anything to add?
Yeah, I mean, I see that context of an enabling environment at sort of multiple levels. I think Representative Ibu has kind of touched on that. But for us, fundamentally, as AKDN, we need an enabling environment to work in this country. And that is created through an accord of cooperation, an agreement of cooperation, where the government gives us certain rights and privileges to be able to do our work, and for our agencies to do our work. Then I take it down to the conditions in a particular community. You can look at an enabling environment in the context of the parks we just talked about. In Kabul itself, we restored a number of parks, monuments. And what has happened around Bagi Babur, which was one of the first parks we restored, is that the park itself has become a place where families go on a Friday, and I've been there on a Friday on a picnic with one of my staff. Um, you could be in a park in London, you could be in a park in Toronto, it doesn't matter. It's a park, and people's behavior changes. And that environment actually enables a very different way of being than you are outside the walls of that park. But just as importantly, around that neighborhood, we are now seeing gentrification. People realize the value of this park in this community, and so the prices of housing is actually rising. So you see this kind of revitalization starting to happen in the neighborhood. And that is what started with a very basic investment in restoring a park. You see it in terms of providing access to education. You create an environment where a girl can go to school in a community that is supportive because we've had the conversation of the community and they support education, then they will help that girl right into her ultimate aspiration as a career, into entrepreneurship, into whatever she wants to do. So I think I look at that question in kind of different sort of systems in which we operate and the kind of enabling environment that needs to happen within all of those systems.
And Representative Merrily.
Well, if you could stay back a little bit with the indigenous philanthropy, I mean that conference in Islamabad was a very significant outcome, and the outcome was the launching of the Pakistan Center for Philanthropy. Now we may want to understand what did the Pakistan Center for Philanthropy really achieve. One of the critical outcomes of this center was that it inspired trust, it inspired confidence, and more importantly, working with the government, it created an enabling legal, fiscal, and regulatory regime that actually promoted and recognized philanthropic action. So it really transformed how philanthropy in Pakistan at that time was given, and the recognition that it needed, so that we would have a greater effort in terms of indigenous philanthropy that can be channeled towards sustainable development. The second was that the research of the center informed us that there are many ways of giving. It was not only financial. It was time, it was ideas, it was experience, it was professional skills. And it was very important that in order to be a donor, you did not need to be wealthy to be a donor. You could donate in anything that you could. And that donation was then encouraged, and more importantly, it was recognized. So I think this was a very important time in Pakistan at that moment, where we studied the indigenous philanthropy, created an institutional response to that, and today the whole notion of indigenous philanthropy is quite different. The second quick example I like to give is that, again, with the help of the Canadian government, we established an entity called the Microfinance Institute. And the reason why we did that is that when we went to establish a formalized microfinance institute in Pakistan at the time, they did not have the necessary ordinance or the laws to have registration of a microfinance institute. So by establishing a microfinance institute at the time, the network, the microfinance network, followed by creation of an enabling environment in which that the government then accepted the laws and the regulations that were passed at that time by that government, which then actually enabled hundreds of MFIs to register at local level and then at the state level. I think the projects that the AKDN initiates in many of these countries and many of the situations, by itself, they create enabling conditions so that so much more can happen, whether it's in philanthropy or whether it's in the practice of microfinance.
Well, with that, I would like to thank you for this thoughtful discussion. Building bridges, both physically and metaphorically, seems to be one key way of contributing to a more pluralistic and tolerant society. The AKDN institutions in healthcare, education, science and research and culture are critical to development in these turbulent times. I'm sure that our listeners have come away with the rich understanding of not only the work of the network, but also your roles as diplomatic representatives of His Highness the Aga Khan in the countries you serve. On behalf of the Ismaili Jamatkhana and Center, USA, and the Ismaili Centre Toronto, thank you for joining.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.